My brother Derek laughed at my 15-year-old Corolla in front of the entire family at Easter dinner, making jokes about how the hospital must not pay their doctors very well, not realizing the Rosso Corsa Ferrari F8 Tributo keys had just slipped from my pocket when I reached for my phone to show Grandma Helen the photos she'd asked for. Monica, his wife, joined in immediately with that particular brand of cruelty she'd perfected over the past 3 years, suggesting loudly that maybe I should look into pharmaceutical sales since I clearly wasn't making it in medicine. The keys hit my parents' tile floor with a distinctive metallic clink, and Derek bent down to pick them up before I could react, holding them up to the light streaming through the dining room window like he'd found a carnival prize. "Jake, what is this? A replica key from one of those Chinese websites?" Derek's voice carried that mocking tone he'd developed since his real estate portfolio collapsed 18 months ago. "Don't tell me you're buying fake luxury key fobs now to make yourself feel better about that rust bucket parked outside." He dangled the key fob between his fingers, and I watched his expression shift from smug superiority to confused recognition as he noticed the authentic Ferrari Cavallino Rampante emblem, then to absolute shock when he turned the leather fob over and saw my full name laser engraved on the back. Monica had gone completely pale, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, because she knew exactly what an authentic Ferrari key looked like after spending 5 years in luxury brand marketing before getting laid off. I reached across the table and plucked the keys from Derek's suddenly nerveless fingers, setting them down next to my plate with deliberate casualness. "I drive the Corolla to the hospital because the parking structure has had 3 car thefts in the past 4 months, and 2 incidents of keying in the physician's lot," I explained to Grandma Helen, who was looking confused by the sudden tension crackling through the room. "On weekends, I take out the F8 Tributo that I keep in the climate-controlled garage at my condo, the red one I bought 6 months ago after my contract renewal came through with the raise." The timing was perfect, because this was the same Monica who had told my nephew Tyler, right in front of me at his February birthday party, that he should never accept rides from Uncle Jake because I was dirt poor and probably couldn't even afford to put gas in that embarrassing old Toyota. The silence that followed stretched for exactly 7 seconds before my mother cleared her throat and asked if anyone wanted more ham, her voice unnaturally bright in the way it always got when she was trying to smooth over family conflict. Derek's face had progressed from pale shock to an angry red flush that started at his collar and crept up to his hairline, and I recognized that particular expression from our childhood when he'd realized he'd miscalculated something badly. Monica set her wine glass down so hard it nearly cracked against the table, then excused herself to the bathroom with movements that were too controlled, too precise, the kind of rigid composure that meant she was absolutely seething underneath. "Since when can you afford a Ferrari on a doctor's salary?" Derek's question came out strangled, and I noticed our father's disapproving frown at the barely concealed hostility in my brother's tone. "Those things cost what? 200,000? More?" He was doing the math publicly, trying to find a way to make my purchase seem irresponsible or impossible, and I could see the exact moment he remembered that anesthesiologists in major metropolitan areas pulled down substantial incomes because his jaw tightened and his eyes went hard. I speared a piece of asparagus and chewed it slowly before answering, letting him stew in his own miscalculation. 280,000 for the F8, actually, but I put down 140 in cash and financed the rest at 9% because the investment returns on my portfolio are averaging 11% annually. The financial details landed like precision strikes because Derek had spent the past 18 months watching his own real estate investments crater after he'd over-leveraged himself on 3 commercial properties that now sat vacant. The monthly payment is less than what I spend on continuing medical education, and significantly less than what you were spending on Monica's Range Rover lease before you had to turn it in last summer. Monica returned from the bathroom with fresh lipstick and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, sliding back into her chair with the kind of artificial grace that meant she'd given herself a pep talk in the mirror. "Well, good for you, Jake," she said in a voice dripping with condescension. "Some of us prefer to invest in property and business opportunities rather than flashy toys, but I suppose everyone has different priorities." The implication that my choices were immature hung in the air, and I saw my father's frown deepen, because Monica knew perfectly well that their business opportunities had resulted in near bankruptcy. "Speaking of priorities," I said, reaching for the dinner rolls, "how's the property development going, Derek? Did you ever find tenants for those commercial spaces in Tempe? Or are the banks still threatening foreclosure?" The words came out perfectly pleasant, almost curious, and I watched the blood drain from his face again as our parents' attention swiveled toward him with sudden concern. Grandma Helen, who missed absolutely nothing despite pretending to focus on her mashed potatoes, made a small, interested noise that meant she was filing away every word for future reference. The rest of Easter dinner proceeded with the kind of strained civility that made every bite of food taste like cardboard, and I noticed Monica's eyes kept darting to the Ferrari keys, sitting innocently next to my phone like they were a coiled snake waiting to strike. Derek barely touched his food, pushing glazed carrots around his plate while attempting to redirect conversation toward anything that might restore his damaged pride. But every topic somehow circled back to his cascading business failures or my unexpected financial success. When dessert arrived, a beautiful lemon cake my mother had spent 2 days perfecting, Monica suddenly announced they needed to leave early because Tyler had homework to finish, despite it being Easter Sunday and her 8-year-old son's visible disappointment at missing his favorite dessert. I waited exactly 3 days before implementing the next phase, which wasn't really a phase so much as a natural continuation of letting reality dismantle the fiction Monica and Derek had built about my life. Tuesday morning, I drove the Corolla to the hospital as usual, parked in my assigned spot in the physician's section, and spent 12 hours managing anesthesia for 6 surgical procedures, including a complicated cardiac case that required my full concentration. The work itself was satisfying in the way it always was when everything went smoothly and patients woke up exactly as they should, their vital signs stable and their pain managed appropriately. That evening, I stopped by my parents' house on the way home because my mother had texted asking if I could look at their kitchen sink, which was dripping. My father met me at the door with an expression that was half concern and half something that looked like suppressed amusement, and I knew immediately that Grandma Helen had been on the phone doing what she did best, which was extracting information and redistributing it strategically. "Your brother called 3 times today," Dad said as I followed him to the kitchen. "Wanted to know if we'd given you money for that car or if you'd inherited something we hadn't told him about." The implication that Derek couldn't accept my success as legitimately earned hung between us like smoke. I fixed the sink washer while my mother hovered nearby, making the kind of small talk that meant she was working up to something more significant. Finally, as I was packing up the tools, she said carefully, "Monica posted on Facebook that they're looking into investment opportunities in luxury automobile imports, something about how the real money is in exotic car dealerships rather than actually owning the vehicles." The phrasing was deliberate, designed to make my Ferrari purchase look foolish compared to their supposedly sophisticated business thinking, and I felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest. "That's interesting," I replied, washing my hands at the newly non-dripping sink. "Did she mention that exotic car dealerships require approximately 2 to 5 million in startup capital, extensive industry connections, and a location lease in a premium area that would run at least $30,000 monthly?" I dried my hands on the towel my mother offered, watching her face shift as she processed the numbers. Because Derek's current credit rating after the Tempe properties defaulted wouldn't qualify him for a business loan to open a hot dog stand, much less a Ferrari dealership. My mother's expression turned troubled because she couldn't quite figure out whether to defend Derek or acknowledge the financial reality I was laying out. "He's your brother, Jake," she said finally, the familiar refrain she'd used throughout our childhood whenever Derek's competitive streak had manifested in cruelty disguised as brotherly teasing. "Maybe you could offer some advice, help him get back on his feet instead of—" She stopped herself, but I heard the unspoken criticism clearly, the suggestion that I was somehow being cruel by existing successfully while Derek struggled. "Instead of what, Mom?" I kept my voice level, conversational. "Instead of correcting Monica when she tells my nephew I'm too poor to be trusted? Instead of pointing out that Derek's mockery at Easter dinner was based on assumptions he made about my finances without ever actually asking me about my career?" I picked up my tool bag and headed toward the door. I've offered Derek financial advice 4 times in the past 2 years, and each time he told me that anesthesiologists don't understand real wealth building because we're just employees. So now I'm taking his advice and staying out of his business. The following week, Tyler's school was having a career day, and I'd volunteered months earlier to speak about medicine as a profession, bringing some of the monitoring equipment we used to show kids how we kept patients safe during surgery. I arrived early on Friday morning, parking the Corolla in the school's visitor lot and hauling 2 bags of equipment toward the gymnasium where presentations were being set up. Tyler saw me immediately and ran over with genuine excitement that hadn't been dampened by his mother's poisonous comments, asking if he could help carry things and chattering about how cool it was that I'd brought real hospital equipment. Monica appeared 10 minutes later as a volunteer room parent, her face freezing when she spotted me setting up my display station between a firefighter's presentation and a veterinarian's animal crates. She'd clearly forgotten I was scheduled to present, and I watched her mentally scrambling to figure out how to handle the situation without looking petty in front of other parents and teachers. "Jake," she said with brittle brightness, "what a surprise. I didn't realize you'd signed up for Career Day." The lie was transparent because parent volunteers received the full schedule 2 weeks in advance, but I let it slide past without comment. The presentation itself went better than I'd expected, with 23 second graders crowding around to see the pulse oximeter and blood pressure cuff, fascinated by seeing their own vital signs displayed on the monitor. I explained in simple terms how anesthesiologists kept people safe during surgery, how we monitored every heartbeat and breath, and why the job required so much training and education. Tyler sat in the front row glowing with pride, and when question time came, his hand shot up first with an inquiry about whether I'd ever had to save someone's life, a question that let me share a carefully age-appropriate version of a code situation I'd managed the previous year. Monica stood against the back wall with 3 other room parents, and I could see her jaw getting progressively tighter as the teacher praised my presentation and kids crowded around asking additional questions. What she didn't know, what I'd discovered through a casual conversation with Tyler during a rare moment alone at Christmas, was that her unemployment hadn't been a simple layoff, but a termination for cause after she'd been caught falsifying expense reports at her luxury marketing firm. The information had come out innocently when Tyler mentioned his mom being sad about making mistakes at work, and a few discreet questions to mutual acquaintances had filled in the details Monica had worked so hard to obscure. 2 weeks after Career Day, Derek's oldest commercial property in Tempe officially went into foreclosure, and the public record appeared in the business section of the Arizona Republic with all the unflattering details about defaulted loans and failed development plans. I learned about it the same way everyone else did, over morning coffee while scanning the news on my tablet before heading to the hospital, and I felt absolutely nothing except a distant observation that consequences were finally catching up to choices made from ego rather than sound business analysis. My phone buzzed 3 times in rapid succession with texts from my mother begging me to call Derek, to offer support, to be the bigger person in language that somehow made his failure into my responsibility. Instead, I forwarded the article to my financial advisor with a brief note asking her to review the documents I'd been quietly collecting over the past 6 months, ever since Monica's February comment had crystallized something cold and focused in my mind. The documents included copies of Derek's business filings that were public record, screenshots of Monica's social media posts about their lifestyle and investments, and a detailed timeline of every disparaging comment they'd made about my career, my car, and my financial situation. My advisor called back within 2 hours with information that was even better than I'd hoped, confirming that Derek had personally guaranteed the commercial loans and that Monica's name was on the paperwork as a co-signer, meaning their personal assets, including their house, were now vulnerable to creditor claims. "They're going to lose everything," my advisor said with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen this pattern play out dozens of times. "The bank will come after the house within 90 days, and given the amount they're underwater on those commercial properties, bankruptcy is virtually inevitable." She paused, and I heard papers rustling. "There's something else interesting here, though. Your brother filed paperwork 3 months ago trying to transfer the title of their house into an LLC, probably trying to shield it from creditors, but he did it after the default notices were already filed. Any halfway competent attorney is going to unwind that as fraudulent conveyance." I thanked her and ended the call, then sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for 5 minutes, watching the morning sun glint off the Corolla's faded paint. The thing about revenge, I was discovering, was that sometimes you didn't need to do anything except exist successfully while other people's chickens came home to roost. Every choice Derek and Monica had made, from over-leveraging on commercial properties to living beyond their means to alienating family members who might have helped, was now compounding into a disaster that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with their own arrogance. That evening, I drove home in the Corolla as usual, but instead of heading to my condo, I detoured to the climate-controlled garage facility where I kept the Ferrari. The F8 Tributo gleamed under the LED lighting like a predator at rest. All aggressive angles and that particular shade of red that Ferrari had been perfecting for 70 years. I spent 20 minutes just sitting in the driver's seat, not going anywhere, letting the leather smell and the perfect ergonomics remind me of every 60-hour work week during residency. Every night on call, every difficult intubation, and every successful surgery that had built toward this moment. My phone buzzed with a call from Derek, the first time he'd tried to contact me directly since Easter, and I let it go to voicemail. The message that followed was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as reconciliation, starting with hollow apologies about miscommunication and escalating into increasingly desperate requests for a loan, just enough to stop the foreclosure. Family, helping family. Surely I understood that pride had gotten in the way, but now was the time to put all that aside. His voice cracked on the final sentence, genuine fear bleeding through the carefully constructed appeal, and I deleted the message without a second thought. The bankruptcy filing became public record 6 weeks later, and this time, it made the front page of the business section because Derek had been relatively prominent in Phoenix real estate circles before his spectacular collapse. The article detailed not just the commercial property failures, but also the personal bankruptcy, including the revelation about the attempted fraudulent transfer of their house that was now being unwound by the courts. Monica's former employer was mentioned in the 4th paragraph, with a brief note that she'd been terminated for expense fraud, a detail that had somehow found its way into the reporter's research, possibly through an anonymous tip from someone who believed in thorough documentation. My parents called an emergency family meeting, which I attended in the Ferrari because I'd driven it to a charity gala the night before and saw no reason to switch vehicles. Derek and Monica were already there when I arrived, both looking like they'd aged 5 years and 2 months, sitting on my parents' couch with the defeated posture of people who'd finally run out of options and delusions. The Ferrari's exhaust note announced my arrival with a deep growl that was impossible to ignore, and I saw Derek's jaw clench as he watched through the window while I parallel parked the 710 horsepower machine with casual precision. "Jake, thank God you're here," my mother started before I'd fully cleared the doorway. "We've been discussing how the family can help Derek and Monica through this difficult time, and obviously you're in the best position to—" She stopped because my expression made it clear where this was heading and how I felt about it. Derek wouldn't meet my eyes, staring instead at his hands while Monica cried quietly into a tissue, her designer handbag from better days sitting incongruously against their current circumstances. "No," I said simply, remaining standing while everyone else sat. "I'm not in any position to help because I'm not interested in helping." The words landed in the living room like grenades, and my mother actually gasped. "Mom, Dad, I love you both, but we need to be very clear about what happened here. Derek and Monica spent years mocking my career, my car, my choices, and my lifestyle. Monica told my nephew I was too poor to be trusted. Derek laughed at me in front of the entire family. They didn't just disagree with my choices, they actively tried to humiliate me. That was wrong, I admit it," Derek said, finally looking up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I was jealous, okay? You had everything figured out and I was watching my investments crumble and I took it out on you. I'm sorry, Jake. Genuinely, deeply sorry. But we're talking about losing our house, about Tyler having to change schools, about destroying his stability because his parents made bad business decisions. The appeal to my nephew was calculated because Derek knew Tyler was the one member of their household I still cared about. Tyler's stability was destroyed the moment you over-leveraged on commercial properties you couldn't afford while spending money on luxury goods to maintain appearances, I replied, keeping my voice level. His stability suffered when Monica got fired for fraud, and you both hid it from everyone while continuing to spend like nothing had changed. Don't make your son into emotional blackmail when every problem you're facing is a direct consequence of choices you made, despite having access to people who could have given you sound advice. Monica's crying intensified into actual sobs, and my father looked torn between his instinct to protect his struggling son and his clear recognition that I was stating obvious truths. "What do you want, Jake?" Dad asked finally. "For Derek to grovel? To publicly apologize? What would it take for you to help your brother?" The question assumed that some level of apology would unlock my assistance, that family obligation would eventually override my own boundaries. "I don't want anything," I said, and meant it. "I don't want apologies that are motivated by financial desperation. I don't want forced reconciliation that exists because Derek needs money. What I wanted was basic respect, and I didn't get it when it would have mattered. So now Derek and Monica get to experience the full consequences of their choices without a safety net they spent years mocking. I picked up my keys from where I'd set them on the entry table, the Ferrari emblem catching the light. Tyler can call me anytime he wants. I'll make sure he has what he needs for school and activities. But Derek and Monica are adults who made adult choices, and they can handle the adult consequences. The final piece of information that made the situation irredeemable came from an unexpected source 3 days later. Grandma Helen called and asked me to visit, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she had information to share that wouldn't be comfortable. I drove over in the Corolla during my lunch break, finding her in her small apartment that smelled like cinnamon and old books, and she got straight to the point in the way that elderly people who've run out of patience for nonsense often do. "Monica tried to access your medical records at the hospital," Grandma Helen said, handing me a cup of coffee. "She called claiming to be your sister to try to get information about your salary and benefits, probably looking for ammunition or leverage. The hospital security office flagged it because it was so obviously fraudulent, and they have her on the recorded line making the attempt. She fixed me with the sharp gaze that had terrified me as a child. That woman isn't just struggling, Jake. She's dangerous in the way desperate people become when they've convinced themselves they're entitled to other people's resources." The information was disturbing enough that I contacted the hospital security office directly, confirming the attempted breach and ensuring it was properly documented. The security director, a former police detective named Williams, pulled up the call recording and let me listen to Monica's attempt at manipulation, her fake sweet voice claiming to be Jake's sister Sarah, calling to verify his employment benefits for family insurance planning purposes. The attempt was so blatantly fraudulent that it crossed from merely unethical into potentially criminal territory. "We flagged her information in the system," Williams said. "If she tries to access the hospital campus or any patient information again, we'll be notifying local police. This kind of thing, trying to access medical records under false pretenses, it's a HIPAA violation that carries serious penalties." He closed the file and looked at me with professional assessment. "Dr. Anderson, I've seen situations like this escalate. You might want to consider a formal restraining order if this woman is desperate enough to attempt identity fraud." 6 months after Easter dinner, I stood in the garage facility looking at the Ferrari and thinking about how strange it was that the car had never actually been about the car. Derek and Monica had lost their house to foreclosure, declared bankruptcy, and moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of Phoenix where Monica's former designer lifestyle felt like something from another planet. Tyler was doing fine because I'd quietly established an educational fund that covered his private school tuition and activities, making it clear to Derek that the money was for his son only, and came with strict stipulations about Monica never attempting to access my personal or medical information again. The restraining order had been unnecessary because after the hospital security incident became known, Monica and Derek had gone completely silent. Their social media accounts deleted and their presence in family gatherings reduced to awkward, brief appearances where they barely spoke. My mother had eventually stopped pressuring me to reconcile after Grandma Helen had apparently had a very direct conversation about enabling destructive behavior versus allowing people to learn from consequences. Derek had found work as a property manager for someone else's apartment complex, a job that paid a fraction of what he'd been making during his development days, but came with steady hours and no personal financial risk. The Ferrari F8 Tributo sat in its climate-controlled garage bay, pristine and perfect, appreciated on weekend drives through the Arizona desert, where the roads opened up and the car could remind me what engineering excellence felt like. The Corolla continued its faithful service as my daily hospital commuter, racking up miles and parking lot dings that didn't matter because the car's value was in its utility rather than its appearance. Both vehicles served their purposes, and the fact that one was worth more than Derek's current annual salary, while the other was worth about what Monica had spent on a single handbag in better days, felt like perfect symmetry. Tyler called every week, our relationship strengthening now that Monica's poison wasn't being dripped into his ear, and I took him for rides in the Ferrari on Sunday mornings when traffic was light, and his excitement at the acceleration could be indulged safely. He never asked about his parents' financial situation, and I never brought it up, letting him be a kid whose uncle had a cool car rather than a pawn in adult conflicts he shouldn't have to navigate. The last time I saw Derek was at Thanksgiving, where he sat at the opposite end of my parents' table and said nothing throughout the entire meal. Monica hadn't come, claiming illness but really avoiding the family judgment that had calcified into uncomfortable politeness. When Derek left early, citing an early work shift in the morning, he paused at the door and looked back at me with something that might have been regret or might have been resentment. It was hard to tell, and ultimately didn't matter. I drove home that night in the Ferrari because I'd earned the right to enjoy the things I'd worked for. And if that made some people uncomfortable with their own choices, that was a problem they'd have to solve themselves. The car handled perfectly in the cool November air, responsive and precise, a machine that delivered exactly what it promised without pretense or deception. In my rearview mirror, the taillights painted the road behind me in red light, and ahead there was nothing but open road and the life I'd built through deliberate choices and disciplined effort, unencumbered by people who'd mistaken my quiet competence for weakness they could exploit.